There is a profound, nearly universal human intuition that concepts like right and wrong, justice and duty exist as absolute objective truths. We feel them with such conviction that they seem woven into the fabric of the universe itself. For centuries, the prevailing consensus, anchored by classical thinkers like Aristotle, held that these moral categories are self-evident. The assumption was that ethics are deduced through pure logic, or handed down as divine axioms, entirely separate from our animal biology. In 1906, the Finnish sociologist Edward Westermark published a radical counterthesis that dismantled that assumption entirely. He argued that morals are not rational deductions at all. Instead, Westermark proposed that morality is a formalized social expression of our most basic, biologically evolved emotional reactions. Our sense of duty is an architecture built entirely from the ground up, originating in the selfish, biological drive to survive. To understand how this works, we can map his theory onto a structural grid, the Westermark model. The objective here is to derive the entire towering architecture of human morality, starting from a single, simple biological reaction. The central tension we have to resolve is how a universal, impartial concept of justice can possibly emerge from a selfish emotional reflex. We are going to trace this exact evolutionary path step by step, watching as raw emotion is processed into tribal custom, codified into formal law, and eventually expanded into global ethics. Mapping this architecture provides the only reliable framework for explaining why human morality varies so wildly across different cultures, geographies, and eras. We start at the base node. Westermark identifies the absolute root of morality as retributive emotion. This is a basic evolutionary survival mechanism shared by many social animals. The negative pathway is straightforward. When an organism experiences pain caused by another, it naturally feels a hostile reaction, resentment. This reflex protects the individual from future harm. The positive pathway works the same way. When an organism experiences pleasure or benefit caused by another, it reacts with a kindly emotion, encouraging cooperation that aids survival. At this initial stage, these reactions are entirely selfish biological reflexes. If someone hits you, you get angry. There is no lofty moral judgment occurring here, only self-preservation. Examining Westermark's original text, we see his explicit proof that these basic retributive emotions serve as the raw material for all subsequent moral concepts. He argues that moral disapproval is, at its core, a refined kind of resentment. Biological resentment is the raw material, but a selfish reflex cannot be a moral rule on its own. It requires a specific catalyst to trigger the transformation. How does a selfish urge to strike back at someone who hurt you transform into an abstract philosophical concept like justice? The reaction has to pass through the second major node of our architecture, the society filter. When individuals group together to survive, society acts as a processing unit. It takes raw individual emotion and applies three crucial variables to it: disinterestedness, impartiality, and generality. This page of Westermark's text outlines the exact mechanism. He states clearly that society is the birthplace of moral consciousness, and that public indignation serves as the prototype for what we call moral disapproval. This relies on sympathetic resentment. You see someone else in your tribe get hurt, and because your survival is tied to the group, you feel angry on their behalf, even though you weren't struck yourself. The moment private vengeance is standardized by the group into an impartial protocol meant to protect the whole tribe, morality is officially born. But a feeling of public indignation is fleeting. For a society to endure, that feeling has to be locked into a permanent structure. This brings us to the third node. The output of public indignation solidifies over generations into custom. Looking at Westermark's research, he defines custom as a moral rule that draws its force entirely from the public indignation called forth by its transgression. In small tribes, unwritten customs are enough. But as populations swell and social structures grow exponentially complex, fluid customs require strict, enforceable formalization. To maintain order, the custom must be channeled through a definite legislative act, hardening into law. The text documents this historical progression exactly. showing that laws are simply customs that have been expressly formulated by a sovereign body to ensure consistent enforcement. The complex legal codes we revere today are, structurally speaking, ancient tribal customs that have been written down and backed by the monopoly of state violence. If this biological and social pipeline is accurate, we have to test it against the massive contradictions we see in history. Why do different cultures have entirely different definitions of virtue, truth, and property? We have to inject real ethnographic data into our model by drawing an in-group boundary. The core limitation of Westermarck's theory is that sympathetic resentment requires empathy to function. And in early human history, empathy stops abruptly at the edge of the tribe. This passage from the research confirms that early moral prohibitions against murder and theft applied strictly to members of the same community. Anyone standing outside that circle was devoid of all rights. We see this clearly in property valuation. Westermarck cites the Roman legal justification for seizing enemy goods during war, noting it stems directly from a lack of regard for strangers. It is not considered theft if the victim is outside your group. This exact same boundary dictates the morality of truthfulness. Lying is not universally condemned. Its morality is highly contextual. Reading from the records on 19th century Hindu communities, we find that a man who lied to cheat his neighbor was hated, but a man who lied to the government to save his neighbor's fields was treated with deep esteem and respect. The moral value of the statement didn't depend on its objective factual accuracy. It depended entirely on whether the lie harmed the in-group or protected it from an out-group authority. Similarly, early Chinese moralists fiercely inculcated the necessity of truth, yet explicitly excused a son lying to conceal the crimes of his father. The structural integrity of the family outranked the abstract concept of honesty. Specific virtues are not absolute truths floating in the ether. They are highly functional survival tools, and their application is strictly bounded by the edges of the tribe. If morality is geographically bounded by tribal empathy, a critical question remains. How do we explain the existence of modern global ethics that attempt to protect everyone? The model requires one final variable to account for the modern world: time, and the rapid scaling of social networks. As civilizations advance, trade routes open, and communication technology connects distant populations, the definition of the in-group is forced to grow. The altruistic sentiment naturally expands outward. Westermarck observes that progress in civilization is marked precisely by the expansion of the altruistic sentiment, embracing wider and more comprehensive circles of humanity. As this circle expands, localized tribal customs scale up, dissolving and reforming into the broad frameworks of universal human rights. The boundary of our moral duty only stretches because the boundary of our sympathetic resentment stretches to include more people. We have successfully mapped the entire architecture. We have traced a direct line from a primitive biological stimulus through the filter of society into custom, formalized law, and finally to global ethics. The rigid laws that govern our modern lives are not dictated from on high by pure reason or a mathematical universe. Our highest moral ideals are built entirely on the ancient retributive emotions of our ancestors, scaled up through thousands of years of social engineering. Recognizing this biological foundation does not weaken the validity of our morals. Anchoring our ethics in human nature, rather than abstract philosophy, actually explains their enduring visceral power. Morality is a vital survival tool we engineered to protect one another, and it remains an ongoing project today.